Hello, Culture Matters podcast. Buckle up. I am so excited for this episode today. Before I bring in our co host, who will introduce our guest, here is a quote just for this episode. Stewardship is a biblical profession. Tom Gaynor. Today, I'm welcomed by our co host, Aleck Arena. I met from a fate 2 years ago in a community, a culture, the Berkshire meeting after exiting an elevator. And we were instant friends. And through his integrity and energy and intelligence, he's put some amazing people on our show. And I'm so excited to introduce you to Aleck Arena. Aleck, please introduce our guest. Oh my God, I'm so excited for today.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. So today we've got a special guest on. So we've got Chris Davis. He's a third generation value investor. He serves on the board of Berkshire Hathaway, Coca-Cola, and Markel. Obviously, he found a higher calling in life in stewardship. So yeah, today our special guest is Chris Davis, chairman and portfolio manager at Davis Advisories. Thank you very much. Um, we'll get the proceedings underway straight away and get right into it because it's going to be a jam-packed interview. So, Chris, what were you thinking all those years ago? Was it the year 1990 you were at Berkshire Hathaway with Tom Gaynor and you're making a joke to him about um, stock picking being a kind of low calling relatively in life, and he said that quote before to you?
Well, I've got to start with a quick correction before I answer that, which is as much as I am proud to be a long time shareholder of Markel, I'm not a director of Markel. I am a huge admirer. And but I think in terms of the question about that quote from Tom, it actually ties into something we were saying just before we started this podcast, which is the idea of the relationships that form in Omaha. I had never met Tom. We just happened to be sitting in the Orpheum Theater, which is where the annual meeting was held then. And we just happened to be sitting in just right behind each other. And I had known the company because it had just come public a couple of years before, and I was an insurance analyst, and then Tom knew about our firm because my grandfather was a specialist in insurance stocks, and we just got talking, and that chance meeting, uh, you know, certainly changed the arc of my life in so many dimensions, and it's it's something it's one thing. I mean, you guys can say you met on an elevator, but you didn't just meet on an elevator. You met because you were both in Omaha because you were curious about a value system, about a record of success. So you already had a filter that brought you together. And of course, that's the way it was for me and Tom. And that specific quote, well, that came out of an interesting piece of life history for me, which is I had for a time studied to be a priest and was going to seminary, and there were a lot of reasons that was not the right calling for me. But I had stayed close with a number of people that did follow that calling, and and so when I went into investing, I loved the work. I'd grown up around the work. I found it was so interesting, the analysis and the future and the personalities, but I always felt sheepish, especially in comparison to my friends who had gone into vocations like teaching and medicine and of course the priesthood. And so I had a stock throwaway line when people asked me about work, and I would say, "Well, it's really interesting. I enjoy it. I get well paid, but it's not a high calling." And I said that line to Tom Gaynor within 10 minutes, by the way, of our meeting. And Tom stopped me and he said, you know, stewardship is a biblical profession. It's a very high calling. Being entrusted, being a trustee, is a very high calling. It's an ancient calling, and it was, it's funny because even when you say the term Wall Street, uh, or today we would say finance bro,
Yeah.
and there's nothing about that that sounds honorable, right? You just immediately think of Gordon Gekko and greed is good.
Oh,
And and so Tom saying that really set me back on my heels and really made me think. And that led to so many other things from that moment. But it's a wonderful quote for you to ask about it at the top here because it really is. It was a defining moment in my entire life, not just my professional life.
I might. You go,
Go ahead,
Jay.
Alex. Go ahead.
I was going to fire away with the second question. It didn't really link into that. So if Jay wanted to fire away with a
Well,
linking
I'm
question.
curious. So Shelby Cullum Davis, that's your grandfather, correct?
Yes.
And he was in a regulator, and then in his mid to late 30s. Now he's investing in insurance companies. So, was there a Tom Gaynor in some in his life that bumped into him and real? Oh, I'm a regulator. Why not be a? I don't know. Like, or how does that unfold?
It's a good question. I think there are a lot of lessons from my grandfather's life. One that I often tell young people is, he made the transition from what he thought was going to be his career and his profession. He was born in, I think, 1908, and he really made the transition, in around 1950. So in about 40, he was over 40 years old when he really found what he was passionate about and talented at. Um, and but his as a young man, his passion was policy and particularly foreign policy. I'm reading a spectacular book. If we get to talking about books, I'm deep in
It's on
this
the list.
fabulous biography of Keynes right now, and I'm
Oh, wow.
realizing how much my grandfather's life is woven into this book because my grandfather's passion was sort of what was going on at the League of Nations and American isolationism versus going on to the stage. And of course, Hoover was involved in the Treaty of Versailles. Anyway, we'll skip all that. But
Wow.
just to say that that had been his interest. And in order to get into foreign policy, which he had studied all of he had done his PhD in international relations. That's where he met my grandmother, who also had a PhD in international relations. They met in graduate school in Geneva in about 1928 or 29, and it's just an amazing story. But they so he
We have it.
wanted to he had so he had written
Love it.
books. He had written about foreign policy, and when Dewey was going to run for president against Truman immediately after World War II, my grandfather backed Dewey, who was the Republican, and was an advisor and sort of a speech writer and wrote foreign policy papers. And he thought he would ride Dewey's coattails right into a job at the State Department doing foreign policy. And of course, Dewey, who was the wild, hands down favorite for the election, lost. And there's the famous headline of Truman holding up the newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman. And so this was an enormous heartbreak. I mean, imagine the disappointment. And it gets even worse because Dewey was still governor of New York at the time. So he had this young man who had worked on his campaign so passionately. And he said, well, I feel I ought to give this young man a job, a political appointment. But instead of being in the State Department, he made him deputy superintendent of insurance. And that was when he became, can you imagine the letdown of thinking, you're going to be, some deputy secretary of state or something, and you're deputy superintendent of insurance for the state of New York. But, my
Wow.
grandfather dutifully went up to Albany and got to work, and the soldiers were coming home. The baby boom was underway. Household formation was just exploding. And, the first thing a young man did when he got married and started a family in those days was to buy life insurance.
Hmm.
And Social Security existed, but it wasn't much. And, this idea of, what if something happens to me? And I think with the war fresh in people's minds, that sense of mortality. And so life insurance was a galloping growth industry, but the accounting is so complex. And in particular, Jay, if you were a salesman and you sold Frank a life insurance policy, uh, uh, the life insurance company would pay you a commission that was probably more than the revenue that life
Mm.
insurance company was going to generate in the first year. But that's okay because Frank made a commitment to be paying this premium dollar for the next 50 years. So it's a very valuable contract. But the way the accounting works, it looked like a loss because by the time the company paid the commission, it had 1 year of revenue. It looked like they were losing money. And of course, what he realized is they were creating enormous value for the owner of the insurance company, but that the accounting obscured that. So he created these rules of thumb to adjust the intrinsic value, or what we call owner earnings, of the business. He recognized that these life
Mm.
insurance companies were trading at 2 or 3 times earnings as he adjusted them. So he respectfully resigned his regulatory job and he borrowed $100,000 from his wife's family. And that was the seed capital that he turned into 800 million by the time he died, and then gave it all away, alas. But, was there a person that created that pivot? It's possible. My grandmother's brother was an investor, but they were not close. But it may have been that he gained some familiarity there. Certainly, as I say, it was his wife's family that bankrolled him. But I don't know if there was that aha moment or if it was entirely just him sitting in the office with a green visor on, making these adjustments and saying, "Oh my God, these are gold mines that nobody seems to understand."
At that time, there's a war, people are coming back. Do you think they're, because of the macro of that era, part of the opportunity and the profit in those insurance businesses, or the fact that the customers were definitely going to pay those insurance policies? And there's something, that's a fleeting thought that comes to mind.
Well, I mean, there was certainly, I think the idea of both the dramatic household formation growth and the baby boom, which of course was the war and, fed that, and then probably that sense of mortality, that idea anything can happen, which of course in a war it can. In peacetime, it's a lot less likely. So people probably weren't totally rational in their weighing of the probabilities, which maybe made it even more profitable. And I think
I'm
there was,
wondering if he had an intuition about it. Like, you knew him as a man.
yeah.
Like if he could have had an intuition about that sector as a consequence of kind of seeing the whole big picture. I'm just, like
Well,
if
I
they're
think
paying
both
very
my
well for
father
these
and
salespeople.
grandfather had an amazing ability to think in these sort of decade-long increments. And so I think you're right. When Warren and Charlie talk about things like the power of compounding as one of those things, you either get it or you don't. It is
Mm.
that's something they just got. They
Mm.
just understood that getting started. And I often think, wow, what if my grandfather had started when he was 20 instead of when he was 40? And of course, the math is overwhelming. Those first years just become so dramatic. Um,
Yeah, unbelievable.
but it's funny in thinking about our time together. I was looking at some various things about timing the market and when people get started. My grandfather had an expression where he said, the best time to invest is when you have the money. In other words, don't try to sort of time the market. And I was looking at, oh yeah, here it is. I just was figuring this out. If you put $20,000 each year into the market over 20 years, I did this from 2003 to 2022. So you have 20 years. And if you bought at the absolute low each year, like you timed it perfectly, the day the market hit the low that year, that 20,000 a year that you had been putting in would be 1,300,000, 1,308,000. Now, if instead you just put it in on January 1st every year, it would be also round to 1,300,000. It would be 1,275,000. If you had the worst timing and you put it in at the dead low, it would be 1,000,001. And you think about how much time, if you just sat on the sidelines, it would be 400,000. So,
Wow.
this idea, and that's just over this 20-year period. But, we put so much time into thinking, is now the time? And I think my grandfather was incredibly lucky to be starting in 1948. But the amazing thing was, if he had started in, my father started in 1968, which was the worst possible time to stop, right? The market hit a high, intraday high in 68 that it was still at in 1981. And, but it was getting started. So I think that you're right to intuit he had this sort of long-term vision, but I don't think he saw this necessarily macroeconomic inflection point so much as he had an insight and he understood the value of compounding and then getting at it rather than thinking about the macro.
Jay pretty much stole my kind of leading question there. I was going to ask, when I went to your office, that's why I started laughing, sorry. So when I went to your office, like, the thing that really stood out for me is like the massive portraits of your grandmother and grandfather, and the respect, obviously, and the influence that you can tell they've influenced you and your thinking and all that. So I was trying to get at what were the best what are some lessons they taught you that you still carry yourself today with?
Well, it's funny you said, because I'm actually sitting in what we call my grandfather's office, and we use this for this sort of meeting because most of the rest of our office is people just walk in and out, and so this is sort of a little bit on its own. But I have a portrait of my grandfather right here and a portrait of my grandmother right here. I wish I could show you.
I know exactly where you're sitting, so I know.
Yeah. And well,
Wow.
they, as much as I would like to sort of gloss it over, theirs was not a very happy marriage or relationship. It was very long. They married for 60 years or something. But they were very, very different people. And so the lessons that I learned from each were almost totally different. My grandfather was, in a way, he was a great man, in the sense of great, and he always viewed himself as sort of a man of destiny, and he was comfortable sort of taking up space, and he was very, even to this day, there are still people that will reach out to me who said, when I was getting started in the business as an insurance analyst at Solomon Brothers, the phone rang and it was your grandfather inviting me out to lunch. He was very cultivated relationships, but in a very sort of formal way. But his lessons were so much about about sort of duty and all of the business lessons about analysis and compounding and, being an owner versus being a creditor. So I'll give you an interesting analogy. It was famously said about Ronald Reagan that the farther you were separated from him in terms of circles of relationship, the closer you felt to him. So you could sit in a living room in Akron, Ohio, and Ronald Reagan would come on TV and look you in the eye, and you felt he was speaking to you. And then, of course, you read the accounts of his children who felt like he was a stranger. And my grandfather had aspects of that. I would say that, within our family, I felt particularly close to him, which was sort of a strange accident. I think it was because I was very irreverent and I would challenge him. But I worked as a cook for him one summer. I mean, it was a very Uh, um, but I was even then aware of how he had sort of he managed uh, his sort of this persona very carefully. So the lessons that I learned from him were very much about duty, about compounding, about business analysis, about integrity, about reputation. Those were very central to him. My grandmother, uh, in a way, was the opposite. She was a very small person. She uh, uh, she was a deeply connected person. The moment you met her, she would want to know all about you. She would remember all of these
Wow.
details. She was always wanting people to get along, connecting them, and sort of making herself almost invisible in the process. But and of course, she was a brilliant woman. She was an academic. She was a writer, but she would never ever imagine seeing herself as a great person. She was just a super connector, and I think from her, just the idea that, when recently Warren has said a number of times that, what really matters is, at your funeral, who's there? Are the people that love you, are the people that you care want to love you? Are those the ones that do love you? And how does, start back? Um, that was sort of the way she lived every day. So people, the closer you were in those circles, the
Mm.
more connected you were. And if you got far out, nobody would know who she was. But the closer you were in, the more you were connected. So in a way, they were mirror images that I think together created, to my mind, the definition of a great life. My grandfather's from the public side in, and my grandmother's from the intimate relationships out.
Mm. What what relationship with their, I guess their spirit or their meaning of their lives was associated with the charitable P component? Because I'm thinking there was a conscientiousness around not just throwing money around young and in the building of it. I'm thinking of the hot dog. Like that's a great story. And then later to bestow that the fruit for everyone. Like, how did that influence their energy or their spirit? I'm asking that specific because our listeners are getting bombarded. I'm getting like I feel bombarded by messaging in the world to consume right now and to what can I get right now, and it's a completely different narrative. So like, what
Well,
was the fruit
I
of how
mean,
they chose to live their life, I guess.
yeah, and I can't recommend for every one of your listeners enough Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money, because it really redefines that consumption ethos in a way that I think resonates with everyone, but particularly with young people, with millennial, with Gen Z, because he really talks about it in terms of getting freedom, getting control of your time, wealth as getting to do what you want with the people you want for as long as you want, not consumption shows how much you've spent. It doesn't show anything about how much you have. And but wealth, the story that he famously tells of Joseph Heller and Norman Mailer at this fancy cocktail party for some
Oh,
hedge fund guy in Southampton or somewhere, and
the Catch-22 author.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And I think Norman says to Heller, how does it feel to know that the man who's hosting us at this enormous party probably makes more in a day or a week than you made from a lifetime of writing, including all of your royalties on Catch 22 and so on. And Joseph Heller said, well, I don't mind because I have something that man will never have. And Norman said, what? And Heller said, enough, enough. And, uh, uh, that is a mindset that evolves. But anyway, all to say, so, in terms of how charity or the idea, I just came back I was in Europe last week, and my grandparents had a very intimate connection to Switzerland. They met in Switzerland at the University of Geneva, and they had wonderful Swiss friends, and my grandfather served as an ambassador to Switzerland in the 60s and 70s. He got out of the market right at the peak in 68. and,
Wow.
and his tenure as an ambassador lasted until 1975 when he comes back in the markets in like flames. And he thought, well, this looks great.
Now it makes sense why he was a man of destiny.
Yeah.
You have that
And my
kind of
poor
history.
father started the company in 68, actually 66, but you know, but anyway, that says something about their relationship.
Yeah,
But
that's
you
awesome.
know, I love, I lived in Europe. I went to university there. There's so much that is admirable about the durability, the grace, the balance, all of this. But, and this is a big but, there's something so profoundly, uniquely great about the United States. And it's really embodied in something that my grandfather lived, my father's lived, many of the greatest men I've ever known, from Bill Gates to John D. Rockefeller. Uh, um, it's this peculiarly American mindset that you build a fortune and then you give it back to society. And, you know, Carnegie, of course, wrote most famously about it. The Rockefellers did sort of a hybrid, you could argue. Um, you know, you look at, Bill Gates, I think it is, I was just doing this work on trying to get this number when I was visiting with their investment operations recently. And I think it is reasonable to draw a pretty straight line to 30 million to 50 million people living on Earth today who would have died before the age of 5,
Wow.
if not for Bill Gates. And now I get that number because the infant mortality rate since the Gates Foundation targeted it has fallen from 10 million a year to 5 million a year. And that's been now over 20 plus years, 25 years. So, and then you can say, well, there's government efforts there, how much is attributable to Gates and vaccines and malaria nets. But let's just round that number and call it 50 million. Uh, that's half. If you think about it this way, if you were to take half of every household in the United States, so look at your neighborhood, look at your family, and imagine if 1 out of every 2 households in the United States suffered the death of a child under 5. So first we think of the lives saved, but then think about the families that were saved. The just inconceivable loss. How on earth does that man not won a Nobel Prize? I mean, it's just outrageous. Uh, and so think of that example
Do
of
you mean in
what.
the sense that if a child is lost in a family, that can create a disruption to the matriarch and the patriarch, their identity of their
Well, and their siblings. I mean,
what
just think of
impact that
what it
has?
would be if you look in your own family, if one of your children died, and the idea that the actions of one man has probably led to, some cynic could say, oh, it's only 10 million. Somebody else, optimist, could say it's 70 million. Whatever. It is one of the greatest feats in modern philanthropy. And that only happens in America. That does not happen anywhere else on earth. Every town that has a public library that owes it to Andrew Carnegie,
Mm.
all the incredible parks that were created by Rockefeller University, the University of Chicago, that was created by John D. Rockefeller. Uh, it is stunning, the culture of philanthropy that is peculiar to the United States. And, when I was in Europe, I was just reminded of it because, people there, it's almost rude to ask somebody what they do for a living, right? Because it sort of presumes they have to work, which implies that they're sort of, pedestrian. In America, it's the first thing you ask. What do you do? And it's something to be incredibly proud of. And of course, it was pounded in by my grandfather. But look at the giving pledge. Just look at the names on that list and how many there are. Now you transfer that over to Europe, you transfer it over to Asia, you transfer it over to India, South America. It doesn't exist where people routinely give away half to 90 to 100% of the wealth they've accumulated in their life, and they give it back to the society. I just, it, my grandfather was clear from the time we were born that 100% of his wealth was going to be given away, and he did that. And my father's doing the same. And, in both cases, it may round to 98% or 92% or 99, but it was, and I admired so much. I would have liked to have had some of that money. Of course, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not, I'm not Mother Teresa, but it's just a stunning example. And do I think, and I'm particularly holding Bill Gates up because I just happened to look and, it may be a couple of $1,000 per life saved. If you were to look, they probably have given away, I don't know, 70 billion or 80 or 90 billion, of which probably half has come from Buffett, right? And half from Gates. And by the way, going back all the way to the question of stewardship in the beginning, the investment operation at the Gates family has done so well that I don't know the number, but I would guess the Gates Foundation, we could look it up, but probably still has 50 or 70 billion dollars in it. So in other words, 100 billion's gone in, 100 billion's been given away, and there's still 50 or 70 billion in there, right? That's investing, right? That's the growth of the stewardship. So anyway, it's an amazing.
There's a Gate quote I love. We overestimate what could be done in a year, but underestimate what could be done in 10 years. Does that quote have anything to do with their or your investment thesis?
That's a great observation. It's funny you say that because I have heard it. I've heard Bill quote it about technology. It's actually, he attributes it to somebody else, and it is somebody else. And I can't quite come up with the man's name who said it. But
That's interesting.
and they describe it as a law or something like that. But it's basically that with revolutionary technology, we overestimate it in the short term and we underestimate it in the long term. And that, by the way, is a little bit of the bubble we're in today. It's the bubble we were in '99, where you get all of this hype and, and then you get this sort of crash, but the hype actually underestimated what was going to come. It creates this sort of short-term euphoria. So
Wow.
things can take longer, but be bigger. And I've never thought of it applying to their philanthropy, but now that you say it, you're 100% right. That's exactly right. Like when they started working on, one source of infant mortality at a time, and, did they imagine cutting it in half from 10 million to 5 million over 20 years? Probably. Well, maybe they did, but certainly the idea of what was going to happen in 1 year or 2 years or 4 years was negligible. But by the time you got to year 10, 15, 20, and the cumulative effect of these things rolling through, and I think that's a great leap to connect those two things.
I just wanted to butt in because you were saying like 50 million people, 70 million people. Like, I don't know, it didn't sound like a lot, but the population of Australia is only like 25, 26 million people. So to save that many people, even as an estimate, is like absolutely amazing.
Well,
and then
that's why I tried to put it in terms of like the U.S. households, because you're right. People just hear, oh, it's, people, we can't, in the Bible, it was all 40. Like if you wanted to say a lot, you would just say 40. 40 was a lot. 40 days, 40 nights. That's a lot. And now, then for a long time, we would say a million. If I had $1 million, I'd be rich. Oh, he's a millionaire. Now it's a billion.
Yeah.
But we have no idea how much bigger than a billion is. Now, I'll give you a little example that I love this because one of my favorite industries over my whole career has been semiconductor capital equipment. Uh, just because I think it's amazing that nobody knows these companies. Well, now they do more, but that make the machines that make the computer chips, right? In other words, we know the computer chips are
Interesting.
miraculous, but how the hell do you get a billion transistors onto something the size of your thumbnail? And I've always liked this industry because I don't think there are kids in garages trying to figure out how to do chemical vapor deposition, better. It's like there's these companies that are creating these miraculous machines with incredible technology that are sort of duopolies and in some cases monopolies. I mean, think of ASM lithography, for example. I mean, the idea that this Dutch company, makes these, it's the only company in the world that can make these machines that can do this. Applied Materials that does, different layers of the process of making these things. But here's a number to think about what a billion is. Uh, on the new iPhone, well, now I think they're 2 billion, but let's just use a billion to be easy. A billion transistors. And, everybody who took, high school physics probably wired a circuit board, all right, when you were in school. And transistors, they have to be connected with a little bit of wire. And so on that computer chip, there's a little bit of wire connecting those billion transistors. And the wire has to be woven around these tight little patterns to connect a billion transistors. So the question is, well, if you took that wire and you pulled it out of the computer chip, it starts pulling it out, how long would it be? Well, you guys got a guess?
Probably wrap around the world. Who knows?
It's 30 miles.
Oh, okay.
There's 30 miles of wire on a single computer chip.
Wow.
And now the wire is only a few atoms thick. So it's very, very thin, but we sort of can't quite conceive of it. So I'm always trying to figure out ways to get these numbers, like, like you said, the population of Australia, or to try to put these numbers in perspective, because it is sort of staggering, but our brains can't really comprehend it.
I'm curious about, you mentioned the chip is one thing, and then there's you're looking at the manufacturers. It seems a common theme in how you think is like, I don't know how to explain it, but like second order or third order thinking. Has that been a part of, or how important is it to think beyond what's directly in front of you as an investor, as a business person, I can't
Well,
really, I don't know how to explain it, but it seems
it's
like
the most fun
how you
part
think.
of what I do. And there was no greater teacher about this particular subject than Charlie, right? It is, Charlie, you see some big outsized effect in the world, and everybody studies that effect, you know. But what you really should be doing is asking yourself, what the hell is going on here? What is going on? What are the forces that create this? So, he had phrases like he would say, people try to predict what's going to happen, but you should be thinking, well, if that happens, what then? What happens next? What are the forces that conspire to create something? So I think that you're right. It's people always want to, the Santa Fe Institute studies these sort of complex adaptive systems, and they're very interesting because people always want to think about, again, going back to your high school physics, you think about like, you drop the ball over here and it hits the ball and the ball goes up here. And people love simple machines. This does this. And of course, there's almost nothing in the world that works like that, right? It's an enormously, things are a whole series of different forces working together. And so trying to think about, how this thing that people are always trying to isolate connects much more, it just makes life so much more interesting. And every once in a great while, you'll see something that is so counterintuitive and it's so satisfying in terms of understanding what are some of the forces causing something, or what are some of the ripple effects that will come from something that aren't directly in line. And as I say, there was no mind I've ever known better than Charlie's at having that completely unexpected take on it. I mean, when you were in our office, you saw we had this letter framed from 1965 that was a letter Warren wrote about why he believed most investors over time, institutional investors, tend towards mediocrity. And he listed 5 reasons. And, you know, one of the things that we did is we said, instead of focusing on how we get to be better investors, why don't we focus on avoiding those 5? Right. And that was a classic Charlie inversion. Um, Elon Musk obviously is brilliant at this. It comes from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? When they create the machine that's going to give them the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and it takes, thousands and thousands of
42.
years, and it spits out the answer 42. And then they say, 42. Uh-oh. What's the question? If that's the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And so Elon famously says, sometimes asking the right question makes the answer is more important than thinking about the answer. So, for example, Elon, in all of this push towards high-speed rail, you think about how high-speed rail has been approached. It's how do we make trains go faster, right? To make them pointier, more powerful engines. What about the tracks? What about, what are the, and Elon famously said, well, isn't a better question, how do we eliminate drag? And then the answer's obvious, right? Oh, well, put it in a vacuum. Then there's no resistance. And then you say, well, if the question is, how do we build a vacuum between Los Angeles and San Francisco? Well, the answer is pretty easy. You just need a concrete tube and you pump the air out and you have a vacuum, right? Just the way the pneumatic tubes in the old department stores, right, used to work, where you'd seal the thing and you push it in and the tube goes flying through to an office on a different floor, right? It was just because, you created a vacuum. And so then it becomes a fairly simple mechanical question to have a train go, 500 miles an hour. Well, that sort of applied with that letter because we framed that letter and we thought, well, how do we avoid group decisions? How do we avoid the asymmetry of risk and reward? How do we avoid the tendency to conform your portfolio and policies to what other large, well-regarded firms are doing? How do we avoid over-diversification? How do we avoid inertia? That last one's the hardest. But so that idea of asking the right question, that sort of counterintuitive thinking, that's so much fun in life.
You have so much breadth of experience around corporate culture, board. What relationship, if at all, does asking questions have with the trust each individual has as it relates to their view of the organization?
Well, I mean, I'm going to go sort of off script here and say, there one of the great sort of cancers, I think, in our system at the moment has come from the expansion and the distortion of, activist investors. And this is going to come back to culture.
We were laughing about this for you.
We're laughing because Jay doesn't like the same people too, but let's go ahead.
Well, integrity in a corporate culture, not lying to yourself, reporting honestly to your owners, being transparent. If in the world that we live in, well, I'll give an example that ties back to Charlie and Costco, and then we can fast forward to how it's playing out today and how it plays out in the boardroom. Um, many, many years ago, we were the largest shareholder of Costco, and obviously we foolishly sold the shares and should not have. But it was a very successful investment, but selling it was outrageously stupid and misguided. But we'll come back to that. But while we owned it, Costco had a staggered board of directors. And, I'm sure you know what that means. Only a third of directors get elected each year. So if somebody wanted to hostily take over the company and ran a slate against the sitting directors, they could only change it 1/3 at a time. And so it would take at least 2 years. Most corporate governance experts say that's a bad idea. And it's a bad idea because it's a type of poison pill and it creates a protection around a mediocre management. And by the way, on balance, over time, I would tend to agree with that. So Costco, a shareholder proposal came up that said, these shareholders said, we want to stagger the board because we think this is bad governance. Now, our view is generally that's right. We like shareholders to have more power and more say. On average, bureaucratic entrenched management can be a real problem. So things that keep management being directly accountable to shareholders, we generally like those things. So Charlie came to see us and he said, I think you should vote to keep the board staggered at Costco. And I said, why? And he said, well, because we're a very thin margin business. And I want a culture where we report results the way that they are. And if we've screwed up in a quarter, we report the loss or the disappointment, because I don't want to create any sort of perverse incentive system to brush bad news under the rug. Now, in the case of our business, what that means is that if we report a terrible quarter, that could disappoint investors, particularly short-term and momentum investors who could panic out of the stock. The stock could go down a lot. And if you got investors, activists jumping in then, the company, you could end up destroying the long-term value creation that could come. So the real example was, of course, when we bought our Costco, it was in the 40s and they reported a disappointing quarter and it opened at 26 the next day. Now, when the intrinsic value of Costco, we estimated at the time, was in the 50s and maybe higher. So it would have been easy for an activist to jump in when the stock was at 26, bid 35 for the whole thing. Let's call him a private equity firm. Bid 35 for the whole thing and get all of that value, stealing it from the shareholders. So Charlie said, look, I don't want management to have an incentive to act without integrity. And of course he was right. And now he wasn't right for every company, but for the culture of Costco, he was right. Now, that brings me to Markel, right? Because, there is no company, that I know that has been run in a more transparent, a more shareholder-oriented way of trying to build a relationship directly. But the way the markets have changed is if you have passive investors representing, let's say, 30% of your shares, which for most companies you do, sometimes it's, 30 is a good guess. That means your largest investor is what I would call a know-nothing investor, right? It's just passive. And what it means is you can get an activist investor in there with a relatively small amount of stock. And if they can convince, ISS or these proxy voting services of something like destaggering a board in the case of Costco, or splitting up a company like Markel, that they might be able to pull it off, even if the majority of the long-term shareholders think it's a bad idea. And it is it is something that I think is continuing to spread in our system. And it's creating an incentive for companies to smooth out earnings, not report bad news, manage the stock instead of the business. And the fear of activists lurking, I think
Oh,
creates
wow.
a real breakdown in the system. And the fact that there were 7,000 public companies 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and now there are 3,000. And who's getting all that value? Instead of my clients getting it, private equity clients are getting it because they are buying, to use the Costco example, they're buying it at 35 or 38, and then they're selling it at 50, but they're doing it with so much leverage that they're making a double or a triple on their equity on that. And, we saw it with companies like Dell with the management buyout there, I don't know, HCA, LBO, and then come public a couple of years later. And that's a terrible thing for, the mom and pop investors that are our clients. And it's just this cancer that's spreading. And it's just, I mean, watching it at Markel today just makes my blood boil because I don't think there's a greater example of cultural stewardship, of alignment, of transparency. And, they go through this period of underperformance and they're transparent about it. They take the big hits up front. They communicate with their shareholders. Of course, the stock underperforms during that period, and boom, you get an activist in saying, split up the company and sell the ventures portfolio to private equity. And it's like, well, let's think this through, fellas. If private equity wants to buy that, why would they want to buy it? Oh, because it's undervalued. Why the hell would we want to sell it if it's undervalued? And of course, if they didn't have that business, these insurance missteps would have been catastrophic. But because they built this three-legged stool, they were able to absorb these hits in the insurance operation. So anyway,
This is a really important conversation, though. I really want to dig in here because when we were listening to a lot of you going on these shows and sharing your story and your wisdom. One of them in particular, you mentioned around the time when you decided not to go into, I don't know how the priesthood or you were interested in the dynamic, the impact or influence a church or some type of congregation could have on a society or a town or a city or something. So like, right, we're all here because we met at Berkshire.
Yep.
And now there's people that are going to listen to this, who knows where they are all over the world as a consequence of that. So my question, where I want to go here is, Chris, how do you combat how your leaders, your stewards combat this very clear, even if it's hard to articulate in words, clear cultural shift or new paradigm, or is it not new? It's just more of the old kind of, the wave went out, we could see you swimming naked, or we can't, and then. So I guess, how do we combat or enlighten the new generations around um, what
well,
stewardship is
it's
and why it matters? Like you can't teach a new dog old tricks. Mungerism, right? I like that word.
yeah.
So how do we have that? This is an important thing I want the audience to think about.
Well, it is. It's hugely important. I'll use Berkshire as an example. It's an important exemplar, right? In other words, it shows the way capitalism ought to work, right? Tom Gaynor at Markel talks about the win-win-win, right? In other words, we create a great environment for our employees, we create great products for our customers, and we create great returns for our shareholders. Those things are all joined together. Um, One of the really awful, insidious lies that has crept out in part through the ESG movement is the idea that shareholder value is created at the expense of another constituency. In fact, I listened to somebody on the radio yesterday and I found myself like an old man, like yelling at the radio, like, that's not true. But it is, it's this idea that, of course, Adam Smith and Keynes and everybody else is sort of demonstrated is false. We see it, of course, in the tariff talks and all of that. But it's the idea that somehow if somebody is winning, somebody is losing. And that has not been the nature of how shareholder value is created in the long term. The nature of the system is this, is if shareholder value is created at the expense of another constituency. So let's say you create shareholder value like Chainsaw Al Dunlop. I don't know if you remember that guy. He was a sort of a corporate raider type, and they called him Chainsaw Al because you go in and he just fire all the employees, and so if you create shareholder value at the expense of your employees, well, that doesn't work forever. If you do it at the expense of the environment, if you do it at the expense of the regulators or the law, or if you do it at the expense of your customers, you cheat your customers. Whatever constituency you want to pick, if your way to create shareholder value is screwing another constituency, sooner or later, society extracts a penalty. Now, they do that through litigation, through regulation, through taxation, some way or another. So you think of GE dumping PCBs into the Hudson River. It might have been good for shareholder value for a time, but over the fullness of time, that was recouped. Now, if you look at the way most shareholder value is created, it's because somebody comes up with a better way of doing something, hires a team of people that are excited about doing that, and they create value by adding value to their customers, creating a career path for their employees, and creating returns for their owners. And, there's no customer of Amazon that is forced to be a customer. Like, people are delighted to use that. And what we create these narratives, there is no employee of Amazon that is there against their will, right? People are choosing where they want to work and how they want to work. And we create these narratives that, shareholder value is created in a zero-sum game, instead of recognizing the basic tenet of advantage, of relative advantage, is that if you do the thing you're really good at, and I do the thing I'm really good at, and we trade the thing I'm good at for the thing you're good at, we both end up richer than if I have to do both, make the fish hooks and do the fishing. So it is this, and when you get a company like Berkshire or Markel or, others that have created value in a way that is so transparent in terms of doing things the right way, wanting to avoid exploitation and so on, those examples are so valuable, and they're particularly valuable as cynicism in the system grows. And so I think it's an incredibly important time for these companies that are exemplars to be held up as reminders of this win-win-win, what Tom calls that win-win-win paradigm, that you create careers for 30,000 people. When I met Tom in Omaha, well, I don't want to guess, but I would be surprised if there were 3,000 employees or 2,000 employees, and now there are 30,000 people building their careers there. The stock was at 22 and now it's 1,500 or whatever.
Have you seen a connection at all with a culture like that and employees choosing to stay beyond the statistics today?
Well, absolutely.
Like impacting in a positive way, because the statistics are saying that the younger generations, they're having so many jobs so quickly.
Well, I know, but we've foisted this onto these kids, right? These kids are being told that the goal of a job is to get as much as you can for doing as little as possible.
Wait, are we talking about PE or the kids?
The kids, right? Good point.
I'm having a little.
So what I mean by that is we've created this background mindset that, without sounding like a really grumpy old man, I think has really come out of academia, where there's this idea, of all of these academics sort of preaching the idea that the nature of companies is to get as much out of their workers as they can and pay them as little as possible. So you, my students, your job is to get as much as you can, get paid as much for doing as little as possible. And that creates the tension in the system.
Oh,
So stick it to the man, right?
what
And
a
of
pernicious
course,
idea.
the way that I explain this to our young people is a lot of them were in college during COVID, but some were even in high school. And I say, so COVID college must have been a great deal because you got the best grades you could get for doing as little work as possible. So if your goal was to get a degree with high grades, COVID was a godsend. I mean, you talk to every kid, you didn't have to do anything. Everybody's got great grades, you fake your Zoom, whatever. And then you ask them, so you say, if your goal of college was to do as little as possible to get the piece of paper at the end, COVID was great. What did you think about COVID? And of course, they say it was awful. And you say, why? Why was it so terrible? They say, well, I didn't learn anything. I didn't make any friends. And everybody cheated. Everybody cheated. And you say, so why do you think work is any different? Why do you think work is different? Like, you come to work, if your mindset is, well, I want to, figure out how I can get paid the most for doing the least, you're going to be alienated from your work the same way you were alienated from your academic experience. You're not going to make friends. You're going to cheat, I guarantee you. You're going to have the fake backdrop in your golf cart, showing you're in the office. See, what separated us as a species in evolution was not survival of the fittest. We are not remotely the fittest. There's a reason we were in the middle of the food chain for most of history. What separated us is our unbelievable ability to cooperate, to trust, to improve things, to tinker, to learn, to teach. Like, that was our superpower. It sure as hell wasn't our claws. It wasn't my physique.
It's good.
And those attributes are wired into us. And so when you go to work thinking about, how do I make this place better? How do I contribute? How do I build relationships? How do I learn? My elementary school, the janitor of the school was named Franklin Sims. And Franklin viewed that school as if it was his personal property. He cared about it deeply. He was proud of everything from the furnace, to the steps. He would chastise the kids for, making a mess somewhere or breaking something. But he was a proud and happy man. Today, we would say, oh, he was an exploited janitor. Well, imposing that mindset on a vocation, I'll give you one more example now that I'm on the rant. Next time you go to the supermarket, I was in Food Town in Cold Spring, New York, a couple of weeks ago, and there were 6 checkout lines. And I was waiting for my daughter was doing the shopping, and I was waiting around for her. So I was watching these checkout lines, and I was trying to do a rough calculus of which were going the fastest. And it was a little hard to adjust, bigger baskets and somebody's paying with a check or something. But over time, I realized this one line was going quite a lot faster than the others. And I started looking at the woman that was the cashier. And what was it? How was she doing her job better? And she was chatting with every single person that came by. Oh, how's your day going, honey? Oh, you're cooking a turkey tonight, or, and she's running it through and she's talking, and she was happy and she was good at her job. And the others are just, getting through their damn shift. Now, it ended up that she had a win-win situation, that she was happier, she was more engaged with her work, and she was doing a better job for her employer. Well, she wasn't incented to do a better job. She just decided that it's more fun to do a better job, to get better at your job. Well, of course it is. That's how we're wired. It's more fun to do better, to figure things out. We just love doing it. So I always tell our people, like, instead of going to work thinking about how much you can get for the least amount of work, if you think about how do I learn, how do I make friends, how do I make a difference, you're going to have a much better life. And by the way, you're going to end up doing better as well. So we've created this culture that ties all the way back to this, as I say, this sort of academic model that capitalism is exploiting the worker, it's stealing from the customer, it's polluting the environment, whatever it is. They create value by stealing from other constituencies. That is so pernicious because what we're ultimately doing is alienating people from what it is to be human, what it is to have a vocation, what it is to work together, what it is to be part of a team. And I'm not idealistic enough to know that there aren't incredibly exploitative employers. Of course there are. Of course there are. But you all know when you get your Amazon delivery or you get your UPS delivery that you have workers that come up and chat and you have people that are miserable and angry. And that sort of engagement with what you do makes a huge difference. So anyway, end of sermon. That was a long sermon, but I think it matters so much, this mindset of people assuming it's a zero-sum game and stealing the idea of work as my grandfather, when he told me he was leaving us no money, which he told us from the time we were about 6, he used to say to me, well, I don't want to rob you of what it is to make a living, to be useful. Isn't it a funny thing that in Britain, they used to talk about redundancy, right? You've been made redundant. Can you think of a worse thing to tell somebody? You're useless. You're redundant. That is so destroying.
Yeah.
People want to be useful. And they want to be useful and as I say, I think it's a particularly beautiful part of the American ethos is people, like working, they like being useful, they engage in their communities, they engage in philanthropy, they do it at all levels of the socioeconomic background, and it's a really peculiarly good part of our culture.
Oh, I want to, on this note, though, if the younger generation is, let's say there's this milieu of, hey, they're taking from you, take back, take. And the incentive system is setting up private capital to instantiate itself in the market, short-term thinking. Then in a sense, isn't that creating a self-reinforcing?
Yes. Yes, you're
And
so
that
right.
doesn't that lead to an opportunity for everyone listening that does care about value and is a value investor or wants, and the reason I ask this direction is like, because Aleck, I mean, he's why we met. He's Catherine in this situation. And I mean that in a complimentary sense. He's the connector. He has inspired me in so many ways, being 22 and wise beyond his years. I learned so much from him every time we talk. And like there's hope. But like if we can go in that, because you're a realist, clearly. Um, and that's important. So my question in that is like, what's the opportunity? Are you excited? I'm afraid. I'm definitely afraid, but you said this on other podcasts. I loved it about doubt and certainty, doubt, fate. The opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. And you said something about the opposite of courage. You need to be afraid to be courageous. Like,
Yeah.
are you excited about the future of value investing? Are you excited about the markets? Are you excited about, or it feels like opportunity?
Well, in your question is one of the most important forces, and it's which is feedback loops are very dangerous, and because they're so powerful. And so there is a feedback loop, which is the more young people think that their employer is out to exploit them, and the more employers start doing that, the more you end up in this sort of spiral. And that takes me back to the private equity sort of mindset, right? If private equity's view is, you jump in, you fire a bunch of people, you cut costs, you demonstrate 8 quarters of revenue growth, and then you exit at a 40% premium to what you came in for. But in the meantime, you had financing at only 6%. So you get a, 80% return on your equity. Of course, the workers are like, well, going back to Markel as an example, Tom feels a sense of duty to his employees, right? They've made a commitment. There are people that have sold their businesses to Markel because Tom has said, you have a home here and we're not going to get in. And, every one of those businesses could have sold out to private equity. But they said, I don't want to, because each one of those managers felt duty bound to their employees as well. And so this sort of private equity spiral feeds into just the cultural thing that you highlight, which is then you get workers that are cynical. Hey, I'm just a cog in the machine. I'm going to look out for me. And so if you take and as I say, with Berkshire, certainly every company that sold to Berkshire over the years probably could have sold to private equity. And they made a choice. And that choice was about culture. And if you're in a world where those businesses can, report short-term disappointments and then have their entire value system upended because you get this sort of LBO mindset back in, it's very dangerous. So I agree with you. There's a feedback loop that can happen where people say, hey, my company just got bought. 40% of the people got laid off after we were all told we were going to make our career here. That I'm just going to, I'm going to shop my resume on LinkedIn. I'm going to work 2 remote jobs simultaneously without telling one about the other, all of this. And so it does feedback. And I would say as investors, I think there's an enormous importance. It's, when they say honesty is the best policy, when Ben Franklin said that, he said it tends to work very well. It's not just that it's a moral good, it's that it actually creates value. Trust creates value. And so I think we have a system. I'm just reading this in that Keynes book I mentioned earlier.
Do you have the title of that book?
It's called The Price of Peace. It's a wonderful book. But the point is the system works when there's trust. People trust that the future is going to be better, and that makes it better. All right? They trust that the people that have got enormously wealthy and that when there's huge inequality, people can tolerate it so long as they think the system is fair. Right? In other words, nobody's upset at how much LeBron makes versus the lowest paid person in the NBA. And they aren't upset for 2 reasons. One, they say, well, LeBron is demonstrably better. So it's fair that he gets paid more. That's one reason. And the second reason is that the worst paid person still gets paid pretty well. So nobody's upset about inequality in the NBA, right? They think it's fair. Our system, those 2 things need to be true for people to think and to rightly believe that the system is fair. People should not be upset about Jeff Bezos getting rich in the sense that Jeff Bezos created something that is of enormous value that we all love and that we all want to use. But what we can't stand is if we think that he got rich in an unfair way, A, or B, that the lowest paid person is not getting paid enough, right? And so as a society, inequality is not an issue. It's become a political issue. But to make it a political issue is idiotic, right? In other words, if I said, okay, we have this huge inequality, I can solve it basically by taking the top, cutting them in half, and leaving the bottom the way they are, I would reduce inequality, but we would say that doesn't do any good. So what really matters is not inequality, it's poverty. What's shameful is that we have enormous wealth in the face of people that are afraid that if they get sick, they're going to be bankrupted and homeless. That's an insane way to run a civilization. So inequality is morally neutral. Poverty is morally paramount. It's solving poverty. And one of the dangerous things is that the more we're in a system that says inequality is unfair, the system is rigged, the less we focus on how do we solve poverty. So I think the NBA is a good example, even though I don't know anything about sports, because nobody thinks it's unfair that there's way, and by the way, there's way greater inequality in the NBA now than there was 30 years ago, way more. The highest paid person versus the lowest, that gap is way wider than it was 30 years ago or in the NFL or whatever. But nobody thinks the system is unfair because they think the best guy got there because they are better. And the worst paid person is still well taken care of and has a pension. By the way, you know, when we say the system is fair, this is, I'm going to get out on a limb here, but is it fair? Let me just put it this way. If I worked as hard as LeBron James at basketball from the time I was 2, my parents gave me a basketball. They said, you know, if I went to the gym as many hours, I worked as hard, I still don't think I'm going to get rewarded for that. And so is that fair? Well, the world can accept that he has greater ability than I have, and that might not be fair. He just has got a lot more ability
Chris,
than I have.
you wouldn't be the most valuable player, but you would be the most valued because of your personality.
But, you know,
Sorry,
I
that's
will tell you, you know, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, these people are in their worlds what LeBron James is in his world.
Yeah, yeah.
They are, it's not just that they work unbelievably hard. It's not just that they are incredibly gifted and talented at what they do. And, you know, I think that not only that the civilization is better, but I think that that money, going back to where we started, will recycle in. But I do think that we do face this sort of very insidious feedback loop that the more the people think the system is unfair, the more it begins to break down. And you get the cynicism at both sides. You get the rich buying their mega yachts, which of course was not, you know, the Warren way or the Bill Gates way. And that's not really great for the civilization, right? You know, creating envy is a very evil thing to do. And it's very evil.
Is it envy without the belief of opportunity? Because the belief of opportunity
I just think to create envy, that's something where I give the Europeans very, very high grades. So I criticize the lack of a culture of philanthropy, a lack of a culture of the honor of work and the honor of making a living. So I would criticize the stigmatization of failure. I think all of those things, the US has a way better approach than Europe. But where I give the Europeans an enormous view is one, they really think poverty is socially reprehensible, and they work very hard to have a safety net. And I think that is a good thing in the world. And two, the wealthiest Europeans work very hard to avoid creating envy. So they don't have a culture of lifestyle of the rich and famous. And I think that the best and most successful industrialists and business leaders of the last century, many of them, you could divide them into those that were, you know, creating envy and those that were living or at least behaving discreetly. And I think it's way better for the civilization if you're doing B. And so I would wish for a few less 100-meter yachts and you know, a few less mansions. And you know, and this is where whatever you want to say about Elon's politics and you know, there's nobody on earth that has worked harder and indulged in materialism less.
On that note, your family's shown it, and you as well, a track record of looking at the manager, not just the circumstances or the product. I know Alec wanted to ask you a bunch about Amazon, as we move towards a close here. You're welcome back anytime to the Culture Matters podcast. It's been a true master class, but I do want to, if we can cliff note on, or cliff note or what, create a loop on that for another time maybe. But the importance of the person and the personality. And Alec, I know want to ask you about Amazon.
Well,
Yeah, okay.
anybody who thinks one person can't change the world, never ate a bat in Wuhan. Yeah. No, but I mean, just look at Microsoft. You had a change in the leader, and look at what happened. One person, huge organization, huge assets, huge franchise. Now, Sundar would be the first to say, that's not me. It was just, things had to be. I don't know. Again and again, I see the difference one person can make. And it's true in governments. It's true. Tom Gaynor was telling me about the mayor of Pittsburgh, a longtime mayor. I haven't studied it myself, but it's amazing how well run Pittsburgh has been. I mean, Pittsburgh could easily have turned into any other Midwestern hellhole. And instead, a culture of philanthropy, intelligent civic leadership, a lack of corruption. And, Pittsburgh went from a smokestack town into a center of academics, robotics, healthcare. And I understand, without being able to speak on this, that there was a period of civic leadership that really helped make that a reality and mustered those forces. So I do think even in corporate America, even at a company the size of Microsoft, one person can make an enormous, enormous difference.
Hmm.
And I
My
do
question.
think that the outsized talent, this idea that, somebody like Jeff Bezos was either just lucky or exploitative is an absolute, it's an insidious lie that is continuing to be told. Whereas the truth is, somebody like that has enormous ability, enormous drive, enormous sort of ability to see things in a very sort of complex way, and some luck, of course. I keep picking on LeBron. I don't know anything about basketball. So I could have said in the old days, Tiger Woods or, I don't know, some football player. I just don't know anything about sports. But, LeBron had enormous ability, enormous work ethic, but I'm sure had a lot of luck too. He didn't get injured. He had the right parents, or he got exposed to the right coaches at the right time. So of course luck is part of it. But there is also just enormous, almost unfair ability coupled with drive, determination, character, competitiveness. And that is true in every aspect of the corporate world and the sports world. And the idea that the system is unfair, I think, comes about because the system has allowed poverty to exist in a way that it shouldn't. And I think that's the most pressing sort of social issue to solve. But investing, to me, the greatest joy in investing is watching the difference a person can make. I think it's the last hope for active investors, not activist investors, but active investors, is that culture does not show up on a screen. And in the short term, results can make it look like a company is failing when in fact they're doing exactly the right thing. And the only way you can know the difference is to understand the culture. And people, yes, there is a halo effect in, oh, this manager's so great because look how well their business did, so they must be a great manager. That is true. And that the halo effect can create a lot of muddiness in the middle. But Elizabeth Anscombe, British philosopher used to say, the fact of twilight doesn't mean we can't tell day from night. And there are companies and leaders that have extraordinary ability and build extraordinary cultures. And I think as active investors, that is one of the last great inefficiencies in the market. And being able to focus on finding those leaders. And it was as simple as reading Jeff Bezos's first annual report. I mean, it is Jamie Dimon's first annual report when he went to Bank One, M&T Bank under the magnificent CEO who just died. I'm embarrassed. I'm forgetting his name. He's somebody I admire so much. It'll come to me in a moment. But you could just read those annual reports and see it was different culture. Now, at a company like Facebook, the annual report is not as useful a document. That is not, but the idea that Mark Zuckerberg was when the stock was down 70% or whatever it was a few years ago, that Mark Zuckerberg had lost his mind and was throwing money around willy-nilly. You didn't have to spend a lot of time just studying. You didn't have to know him personally. You just had to study what he had written, what speeches he had given, decisions he had made. And you'd say, that is one of the smartest people in the world of business. There's nobody alive that understands networks the way he does, understands platforms. So those that ability to look at culture and winning cultures can look different, and to look at the impact an individual can have, that is one of the great joys of this business. And as I say, one of the last backwaters of market inefficiency, I believe.
Yeah. Chris, you answered my question without me actually asking it, so that's awesome. But I am conscious of time, but I just want to get 2 more questions answered for the younger audience.
I'll make my answer shorter.
That's all good.
Listen, I'll move my day. We could go all day. Let's
yeah.
Come
Just
back
about here in Australia. I'm ready.
I'm trying to have mercy on your listeners.
Oh, they love it. They love it. I know it. I believe it.
I was going to ask about your holiday reading list you have in the office. You quickly touched on Morgan Housel's Psychology of Money and how you thought that was important. And then the second question is off topic again. It's with me, you've touched on the concept of like living your life in 10,000 day increments before. And I think that would be hugely useful for the younger audience to be enlightened by that concept of yours. So, yeah.
All right. Well, why don't I start with 10,000 days and I'll end with a reading list? Does that sound good? Yeah. I mean, what I'd say is that people get very wrapped up on birthdays, your 30th birthday or your 50th, or my 60th is coming up this year. Those decades have almost nothing to do with the way we live our life. My grandmother used to talk about her life in thirds. We had a family saying, learn, earn, return. The idea that you spend a third of your life learning, a third earning, and a third returning. In other words, giving it back. And, I think that the mental model, having a mathematical inclination on it, is I looked at it in terms of days. And we live more than 30,000 days, but it works as a rough heuristic in terms of our really active, productive life. And the first 10,000 days, I think you really have to dedicate yourself to going as wide as possible. You explore different partners, different geographies, different vocations, professions, 10,000 days of trying to figure out what you want to do, where you want to do it, who you want to do it with, who you want to do it for. And that gets you to around, 27 or so. And these are all very rough, obviously. And then you have 10,000 days where you go very narrow and very deep. And often that transition is very hard for young people because they feel like, look at all I'm missing. And they don't treasure what it is to go very deep. And so what you get to learn, you learn the same amount, but you're learning it in this very deep way. It's when you're really ideally committed to your profession, committed to your community, committed to your family. And people experience it as the world's shrinking, but it's not shrinking. It's just changing its dimension. And a lot of unhappiness is caused when you don't realize that change. And then around 20,000 days, it's somewhere in your mid 50s, there's this next sort of transition, which is where, in a way, your professional life, it's not that it's coming to an end, but it's unlikely to change in dimension. And if you're lucky, you get to do, I mean, in my case, I hope I'll get to do what I love doing, until I'm 90 or 100. I certainly have some great role models in that. But your kids are leaving. Often what you've achieved professionally is fairly defined. You have new freedom, and it's a chance to go very wide again. And so I think it's just useful to think about life in those thirds. And now I'll get to your reading list. I, you know, you're right. I mean, every young person should read Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. It's a real gift. I think people should really work hard to read a book that reminds them that the world is getting better, and it's getting better not just in almost every dimension, and has for quite a long period of time. And so there's a number of books that I would recommend, any one of them, but there's one that I particularly like recently. It's got a terrible title, but it's called The Power of Bad. Um, there is a book called The Rational Optimist.
Yep.
There's the book about the angels of our better selves. I may have that title wrong, but it's
Better Nature, yeah.
yes, the
Steven
better
Pinker.
nature of our angels. But they all sort of remind you of what I was saying about what it is in our character, in our DNA, that makes us cooperate, and that's our superpower. And yet we continue to have this mindset that if you scratch the veneer of civilization, we're all going to be killing each other. And of course, all of the data indicates the opposite. And so the nature of how our system improves, that's things like the rational optimist, the angel of our better natures, how the tendency towards cooperation, that's a useful. But if I was going to give you two new books that I just happened to love recently, I mentioned the Keynes one. I think that's amazingly interesting, and very, very relevant to the time that we're in as people think about
yeah.
what is the value of money, and how it
The Price
relates.
of Peace.
The Price of Peace, yes. And then I'm embarrassed I can't think of the author, but it's a biography of Keynes. And then the second one, there are two books by the same author, because I think every young person, in addition to AI or related to AI, should come to terms with two big implications. One is quantum mechanics, and one is biotechnology and how that will change. I'm going to leave the biotechnology on the side. There's some technical books in it, but it's just worth just getting more familiar. But on the quantum side, there's a book called When We Cease to Understand the World, that is just a spectacular, and it's not a science book. It's really a fictionalized biography of Heisenberg. But it will help you understand not quantum mechanics, because we're never going to understand that, but it will help you understand why it's such a big deal. And the only analogy I would give you to think about is, imagine how hard it was for people to really imagine that the world was round. It's so hard to imagine, let alone that it's round and spinning around the sun. And to change that worldview took hundreds of years. Uh, Quantum mechanics is that order of magnitude of a shift in how the world works, how causes and effects works, how consciousness works. And this is like a little game. It's only about 100-page book, which I love too. I think it's translated from Portuguese, if I remember right. But it just gives you, it's like a little peek into the idea of how almost inconceivably enormous a change in our worldview we need in order to bring our internal conception of reality into accord with the science and the physics of that show the nature of what reality is. So that's a great one. If you wanted to throw in one by the same author, I said there were two by the same author. I would recommend a book called Maniac. And if the first book is about trying to get a gateway understanding of quantum mechanics, the second is to get a gateway understanding of AI. but it's told again, taught through stories, because that's how we learn. We learn through stories. That's how we learned all through the history of Homo sapiens. We learned from stories around the campfire. So I think it's a great way to approach a difficult subject, is to read stories about it rather than textbooks about it. And that one on AI happens to be a fictionalized biography of van Neumann, the genius Hungarian polymath, who invented the first real computer. He also invented the hydrogen bomb, mutually assured destruction, the Monte Carlo simulation, and
Wow.
AI. So it was quite a life. It is worth reading. And the book begins, with his birth in Hungary around the turn of the century, or early or late 19th century, and ends with DeepMind, the Google computer, winning at Go, the game of Go, and really helping you understand why that victory. And there was a particular move, I think it was the 43rd move, but I can't remember for sure, that the computer did something that was so unexpected and that could not even conceivably have been programmed in. And that pivot from brute force to intelligence, and it happened first in a chess game, and then, but really the Go game, and that the book ends with that, and you begin to get a sense of this snowball that was tumbling down, starting with van Neumann's first computer, the Maniac, which was the name of the computer. People remember ENIAC, but ENIAC was an order of magnitude less than what Maniac, which of course with his wry sense of humor, he named his computer, which was in the basement of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton for 20 years, running nuclear simulations, I think, and how that snowball got bigger and crescendoed into where we are today. So fabulous books.
Chris, thank you so much for this. You're like the Homer of Berkshire. And I can't wait for audience to be
That
introduced.
Homer Simpson?
Iliad of the Odyssey, guys. I do want to, because out of tribute to Charlie, but just what would he want our audience to know, closing in this episode? What would he want our audience to know?
Well, just the joy. He called it a moral duty to try to get a little wiser every day. And I would recast it and say just the joy, and and not joy like giddy joy, but more the sort of contentment that comes from continuing to try to figure out how things work, and to just try to get better. And I think, cynicism is so dangerous. Skepticism is very valuable. Skepticism says, why is this true? Show me. Cynicism says, why bother? And we're in a world now where there's so much cynicism. Oh, the system is rigged. Why bother? I can't get ahead, or I can't, and cynicism ultimately, like envy, cynicism destroys the person who holds the view. And so it's a particularly stupid way to live. And I think so I would take everything Charlie said about trying to get a little wiser every day, and the richness in your life that can come from that. And I would add to it, and then he added to it, the danger of envy and resentment, avoiding those things. And then I would add something that I've never heard him talk about, but I think is the next postulate, which is, for God's sakes, avoid cynicism. It will just destroy your life. So, Charlie held out addiction, envy, and resentment as the three biggest causes of misery. And I'm now going to throw cynicism on there because of what I see in young people struggling with. And if you can purge those things, those four things, your life is going to be so much fuller and richer, and your relationships and your relationships, most importantly, with yourself. So that would be my addition to Charlie's wisdom, my footnote.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Aleck. You want to close us out?
Yeah, just thank you so much. I thought you were going to do the quote of the day, and then, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
well, we were fighting, not fighting, we were philosophizing back and forth, wanting to do the best job possible. Think like what, because there's always a quote in the beginning of the episode. And originally I wanted to go with Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. But I liked Alex's rationale around Tom Gainers. And so, in the spirit of Culture Matters, thank you so much for coming on the show. If what's one way our listeners can get in contact with you? Let's say that they want, because you have obviously we didn't talk about your fund, but people can actually participate in that are everyday people. Maybe you want to
everyday
give them a chance
people.
to do that.
Very early in my career, I had some people telling me why would we be in mutual funds when we could be in hedge funds? And I like that our average client has $30,000 with us. It just,
Yeah, so
to
maybe
me,
point them in the direction that they can get in
oh,
contact.
so, we have a website at Davis Advisors, and you can see, you can get a sense of who we are and how we try to do things. And we take that stewardship ethos. People entrust us with their savings, and we care enormously about that over the long term. And the website will explain certain aspects of that, but we're not in the business every day of sort of comparing ourselves to the market and this and that. But we are in the business of trying to build wealth for our clients so that they can then use that to achieve the sort of goals that Morgan Housel talks about. That independence, because a big part of human dignity is never becoming dependent, and
Mm.
uh, and we think that's the responsibility that we have.
If you're listening to this episode, please share this with a friend, someone that you believe needs to listen to this. It'll make their life better, like it has ours. Alec, thank you. Chris, thank you so much. And we will see you next time on the Culture Matters podcast.